love the way you read that, Evelyn. Thank you. That was perfect. And Dennis, thank you for choosing that. And now we would like to introduce Dennis for his talk, Fire on the Mountain.
Yeah, like I said, I hope this works as a responsive reading. I can take this one on the road, right? It was a warm, sunny January evening. Yes, warm in January, because I was in South Africa, where January is summertime. The evening's warmth was a pleasant respite for what had been a very hot, dry summer day. I was in my daughter Lindsay's backyard in our rural community named Grayton. As night fell and darkness settled in, we looked up at the village. We looked up at the highlands where the village is near, and we saw a bright orange blaze. There was literally fire on the mountain. The higher reaches of the nearby peaks visible from the yard were ablaze. The fire took a sort of zigzag shape in the night sky as the fire crept through a canyon between two rock faces. It was beautiful. It was eerie, and it was a bit terrifying. We knew we were safe because of the distance, and yet touched my heart with the fear that stretched beyond that present moment. It became part of a nagging fear that lingers in my consciousness. It's part of the fear that arises because I know that such fires will emerge all across the globe with increasing frequency in an increasingly warm and in many locations dry planet. It was just 2 northern hemisphere summers away when I had looked out from my own garden in my backyard to watch a helicopter dropping buckets of water on a fire over the ridgeline near where I live. In Grayton, South Africa, this was not the first fire of their season. On Halloween night, a fire had crept right up to the edge of the village. My grandson Jasper had been disappointed that trick-or-treating was postponed. It happened a week later, but his pumpkin costume and his baby brother Teo's ladybug costume would be set aside for another day, as the volunteer fire department and many other community members, including my son-in-law Frank, rushed to help stop the flames. Lindsay and the kids were prepared to evacuate at a moment's notice. That fire claimed many acres of native fine bush brushland to the east and north of Grayton and the neighboring community of Grenendal. Now, this earlier fire had created a fire break that ensured that the new fire that we witnessed that night in January would not reach us. The flames we witnessed had been sparked by another fire that was raging to the south and west of the village. This fire traveled through canyons in a wildland reserve where I had planned to take a special 76th birthday hike from Grayton to the nearby town of McGregor, some 18 kilometers away. It's a noted hike. It's not quite as lovely in the same way as it has been. Now, my grandson Jasper had been sitting next to me watching the fire, and sitting on my lap was my new young infant grandson Teo. The song lyrics we shared as our reading echoed in my head. Fire on the mountain. Fire on the mountain. Fire on the mountain. Fire on the mountain. The next morning, the air was filled with smoke. I skipped my usual morning hike, which I always do when I'm there in Grayton, because I have asthma, so being outside on a smoky day is not a good choice for me. And it was also not a safe time for the little ones. We had a quiet yet joy-filled inside day. I spent the day reading stories and playing board games with Jasper and sharing snuggles and giggles and just lots of hugs with Teo. When Teo went down for a nap, I logged in, as I do almost every morning, to the New York Times. There I saw reports from Minneapolis of another emerging disaster fed by fiery rhetoric out of Washington, D.C. Angry words and violent action had inflamed the entire community. It seemed like a dragon with matches is loose in the world. Fire on the mountain. Thousands of people in Minneapolis rose up to protect their neighbors. It was not unlike what the volunteer firefighters had done in Grayton. I could do little but to watch it burn from a distance. In Minneapolis, hundreds of citizens rose up in protest. Sandra Good and Alex Petty, who sought to protect their neighbors, were brutally murdered. A call went out via the UU Ministers Association, and I saw it online, for clergy to come to Minneapolis. An earlier call that had gone out long ago to UU ministers had been an invitation to Selma, was remembered online. In that historic time, nearly half of the Unitarian Universalist clergy people across the nation had answered the call to go to Selma. Reverend James Reeb, a young minister from suburban Boston who sought to protect people's voting rights, came to Selma. Reeb was brutally murdered outside a cafe there. This time, in our time, hundreds of my colleagues, including Elias Poor, who serves the nearby congregation in Roseburg, answered the call. If I'd been in the U.S., I probably would have gone, especially since the UUA even offered to help with travel expenses, though I would have had to find my warmest clothing for such a journey. As our stay in South Africa continued, I read news reports from closer to home. It seems that ICE and other federal agents had attacked protesters in Eugene with tear gas and pepper spray. The aggressive actions began on a Tuesday afternoon as a group of peaceful protesters gathered for a weekly interfaith event called Singing for Our Lives, where each week after week after week, I, through most of the fall, and many other people of faith have gathered to sing and pray and show support for our immigrant neighbors. I no doubt would have been there if I'd been home. Now, that same evening, after some petty property damage that police called a riot, the federal forces brought more firepower and into the streets of my hometown. The smell of pepper spray and tear gas floated across downtown Eugene. People in restaurants could sense it. People with asthma struggled. Our dragon in chief raged on Truth Social's site about a so-called building breach in Eugene. Meanwhile, the Register Guard, hardly what one would call a progressive news source, reported how a peaceful protest had been met with a violent response. Again, I could do nothing but watch from a distance. It was heart-wrenching, and yet, in this winter of fires and fiery rhetoric, my heart has been filled with opportunities for growth. During my time in Grayton, each day began with the sweet sound of my grandsons. On some mornings, an early rising Jasper would quietly sneak into our bed. Time to wake up, whether we were ready or not. Other mornings he'd be a little more patient, but he would join us out on a little patio outside of the room where we were staying for our morning tea. Several days each week, when the nanny was off, and since both Frank and Lindsay were working, we were primary caregivers for the baby. Because my wife Suzanne had taken a fall early in her journey and ended up with a broken arm, she couldn't lift the baby, she couldn't do diapers, so I was joyously on duty. You need to understand something about me. I am baby gaga. Have always been. I once described, I have a something I call womb envy. I'd always wanted to have a baby. So I hold on to babies as long as I can. And I guess I have a pretty good energy with babies as well. A collegial friend once labeled me as a baby whisperer. I'm pretty good at getting babies to go to sleep, and I got to do that with Teo the very first night we had arrived. So Teo and I had lots of sweet time together. Each hour, each precious moment, I felt deeper in love with that sweet little baby who joined our family in August through adoption. Dismay and anger, sadness and angst all stood side by side with joy and wonder and deep love in my thoughts and in my emotions. A collegial friend once shared with me a notion that they attributed to the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron, that a heart that is breaking is a heart that has an increased capacity to grow. In my weeks away, my heart did stretch a bit. Most days before it was too hot, I found time for a good walk, sometimes with Teo in the stroller, and occasionally in a backpack. On my baby duty-free days, I took long hikes into the Fine Bush Reserves, walking where fires had raged. The photo on the order of service and projected here is from one of those morning hikes into the area that had been burned in January. It's a photo of a protea after the fire. It's the national flower of South Africa. I encountered this particular dark beauty on a hike partway up that trail to McGregor. As I climbed the steep and rocky trail, all around was devastation and blackened and gray singed plant life. It appeared lifeless, yet it had a stark beauty. When I looked closely, I noticed on the ground little brown clusters of something, and I looked closer, they were clusters of seeds. Seeds that would, in time, have the possibility of becoming a new generation of flowers. There, amidst the devastation, I found a reason for hope. For I knew that both devastation and renewal and restoration are possible. Many days I hiked on the reserve that had burned 3 months earlier during the Halloween fire. There, the grasses and ferns had already begun to reemerge. On several mornings, I hiked into a beautiful creek-filled canyon, what South Africans would call a kloof, where small trees and shrubs had been saved from the fire. One day, on other days, I walked along Asian trails. Along the trail side, there were occasional clumps of green. In the week before we left, I began to spot occasional blooming plants. A A few bright yellow and blue blossoms had begun to unfold amongst the gray. A few days before we left, some 100 days after that Halloween fire, I spied near the trail the red-tinged protea blossoms beginning to unfold with new life. I stopped and I sat on a nearby stone, pondering possibilities and remembering deep truths. Fire and devastation happens again and again and again. Restoration and renewal happens again and again and again. When I got back to the house, my two South African grandsons, one white and one black, were laughing and rhythmically pounding on a bucket together. Teo really likes percussion, and his big brother encourages it. Watching those two gives me faith that racial harmony is possible. Watching them deepens my commitment to seek to see a world where there is peace and love for everyone. By the time I returned to Oregon, war had broken out and our nation was dropping fire from the skies. But at home, in my garden, where the winter's freezing weather had turned much of my plantings a lifeless gray, shafts of green daffodils were reaching toward the sky and on the verge of blooming. Now, 2 weeks after my return, they are offering a brilliant yellow clarion call to spring. The temporary death each winter brings us was being replaced by the new life of spring. Such renewal and restoration comes again and again and again. In the dark and cold days of winter, we need to remember spring will come. I believe that things will get better in America, that these dark times will be brought to an end. I believe that we can slow somewhat the ravages of climate change because I've witnessed positive changes in the past. Though it may be a long winter, what I have witnessed before shows me what can be. Just some examples. The role of women as powerful voices in our society and globally has expanded over the years, though patriarchy is certainly trying to make a comeback. LGBTQ folks are no longer classified as aberrant, and one has the right to marry whom they love. And I believe that protests many of my age cohort engaged in helped to end a war in Vietnam. Things have changed because folks have stepped up, because folks had faith, and because folks came together and put that faith into action. Things have changed for the better. In these dark days in our country and in the world, I remember that there had been dark times before, and that in the darkest of times, people held on to each other and held on to that which is of greatest importance. I remember a poem which I've heard set to music. It was reportedly found in a basement in France where a Jewish citizen had sought to hide from the Nazis. It reads, "I believe in the sun even when it's not shining. I believe in love even when I don't feel it. I believe in God even when he is silent." Believe. Believe in the power of people. Believe in the power of love. May it forever be so. Amen. Blessed be.